Welcome to Represent NYC on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm lucky enough to be joined today by State Senator Brian Benjamin, who represents the 30th District in New York. Hi, Brian. How are you?
I'm well. How are you doing?
Really, really good. Good to see you.
Good. Good to see you as well.
I really want to talk about how COVID-19 has affected your district. I mean, this city has been a tale of not just two cities, but many different levels of devastation. And give me an idea of what's been happening in your district.
Yeah, so thank you for asking about that because in this time, it's important to remember that COVID-19 is still ravaging in our communities. And I am the senator who has the most NYCHA developments of any other senator in the state. And, one of the things that we have noticed in sort of high poverty, high density areas, COVID-19 has been really aggressive. And part of that has to do with how we started. When we first started dealing with COVID-19, there were some things that were advised. For example, if you have it and you're asymptomatic, just stay at home and self-quarantine. Well, the first issue with that is, do you have the space to self-quarantine? And if you don't have the space to self-quarantine, for example, if you have 6 or 7 people living in a 1-bedroom or a 2-bedroom, all of a sudden self-quarantining is an issue. But then also spreading becomes much easier. And if you compound that with living in, 25-story buildings where you have hundreds of people using one elevator and one staircase, that it becomes a big issue as well. And so we started to notice that, certain parts of the district were really having rough numbers. And, fortunately, we started to get our arms around the issue and have been radically increasing the amount of testing sites that are specifically targeting neighborhoods that have most concerns. And we've also started to bring in churches and faith-based testing sites where people can go and get tested where they feel comfortable and already know some of the parties. So that's one thing that we've been doing. Social distancing and PPE. We have been aggressively focusing on that, but it's been a struggle, right? Not everyone is watching the daily briefings, and many people at first heard, oh, well, COVID-19 doesn't really impact young people. It's old people are the people who are most the victims there. And so we've just had a lot of fumbles that were necessary, but we have tried to turn that around. We have been aggressively delivering masks throughout the community. We have been aggressively making sure everyone's got hand sanitizers. There have been a lot of work that we've tried to work on to get people what they need. Public education. My office has been doing mailers and also really getting out and touching people on the street. And that's kind of how we've been trying to deal with it. But, we are, in my community, more of the essential workers than the Upper West Side or Upper East Side, right? And so that then leads to people being on the train, being in the elevators, and that makes it harder. But we have been doing all we can. And the numbers are coming down, which is good because people are getting it. But we've got to stay focused because just like that, the numbers can turn around.
Are you still working to sort of like bridge a gap with the food, the lack of food?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We right now are working with a number of the churches. First Corinthian Baptist Church has an amazing food pantry, as do other churches, and also working with World Central Kitchen, who has been delivering a lot of food throughout the district, working alongside, property managers, some of our senior centers who identified some of the seniors who have issues, working with our nursing homes. We have been aggressively trying to get food out in the district, fresh food, because that's so important. I was just yesterday at one of our NYCHA developments, Douglas houses. I was at Wilson houses and also at Dunbar, sort of delivering food, working alongside some nonprofits. So we are completely focused on food insecurity because COVID-19 is already a problem. When you add food insecurity on top of that, it becomes much more complicated. And there are a number of folks who literally have to shelter in place. I mean, we have some of our seniors who it's hard for them to get up and downstairs. We got to protect them. So we've been focusing on that as well because it's very important.
You mentioned NYCHA, the NYCHA buildings. Has there been any sort of like improvement on how they've been able to clean and get repairs and things like that?
So we've been working very closely with NYCHA's management. This is something that a lot of us made sure that the mayor and Greg Rust, the new chair of NYCHA, are very focused on, particularly in communities of color, making sure that they're having adequate cleaning, and that the employees have adequate soap and all of the necessary items to keep these buildings clean. So we've been tracking that and following that, and things have been getting better. But you always got to stay on top of it, because it's a big task, but it's so important. We've got to protect all of our residents from unnecessarily contracting this disease, because that ultimately impacts all the rest of us. There are folks who live in NYCHA who are home health aides, right? So you want to make this really has tied us all together, because a lot of the essential workers are essential because they're helping everyone else. And so your life is in their hands, and their life is in your hands. You got to keep everyone safe from COVID-19 for all of us to survive.
Yeah, I want to pivot a little bit to unemployment, and so the pressure of the upcoming rent, right? This started in March. Now we're hitting July rents coming due pretty soon. Is there any sort of help on the way?
Sure. So two things. One is that the state has provided well, that's not true. The Assembly and the Senate has passed a bill that is on the governor's desk that would provide $100 million of rental relief for residents. So that's something that we hope the governor signs, and we can get that money on the street.
So if it's signed, if it's signed, let's say by the time this airs, it has been signed, what would that mean for people?
That would then mean that the state housing agency will be required to, in a very short period of time, come up with protocols for how they receive requests. Because what has to happen is tenants would have to make requests for rental relief for some of that fund, and so they'll have to give that request to the state housing agency. The state housing agency has to create and I'm sure the state housing agency is already kind of preparing for this, but they would have to have the sort of application process by which people can apply for the funds. In the way we wrote the bill, the funds will be provided on a first come, first served basis across the state, based upon people meeting COVID-19 hardship related requirements. We are still fighting very hard to get money from the federal government, because we believe that the real answer here is federal support. And so once we are clear on where we are with that, then we know how the state needs to work to try to supplement that to meet the full need. But we think it's important to push hard, and we know our congressional delegation is working hard on this, push hard to get federal support, and then we will provide supplemental support on the state level to help with the need.
Right. Okay. So another little turn. You're the chair of the Revenue and Budget Committee. I want to sort of get people to understand what your rainy day fund is, what that is about.
Yeah. So we were able to pass a rainy day fund that I sponsored in the Senate and in the Assembly. And what the rainy day fund basically does, it provides the city of New York with the ability to actually start saving for our future. Now, most people will say, well, why are you doing that in the middle of a crisis where you have a shortfall? It's precisely that time where you put that in place so that you are prepared for the future crisis, right? Right now, the city is looking at least an $8 billion shortfall, trying to figure out how we're going to get that from the federal government, or they want short-term borrowing from the state. In my view, if the city in times of plenty had a rainy day fund where they could have saved money away, then maybe that $8 billion number is $4 billion, and that's an easier number to manage, or $8 billion is $2 billion, or it covers the whole thing. It's important that it's like you and anyone else, right? Everyone wants to the extent you can, try to save money for a rainy day. The government should be no different.
So you are going to be running for city comptroller.
Correct.
And what do you think could be done to add revenue to the city then we're in such a dire situation right now? There are a lot of things being thrown about. What are some of your thoughts?
Well, I think a couple things. The city doesn't have a lot of room to manage this. The state really has a big role in that. And so, for example, the city does toggle with the property taxes, and there's a local municipal tax, but really they need the state to step up, or the federal government to step up and assist. And there's been some real conversations about a range of revenue ideas. I think we think the first revenue idea is the federal government providing us with providing states and localities with the money that it needs to keep our government going. We have some ideas in place that we would look to supplement depending upon where we end up with the federal government. But let's be clear, the amount of need on the state level and on the city and on the multiple city levels to deal with this crisis, while at the same time we've had to shut down businesses. So sales tax is down, personal income taxes are down. A lot of revenues are down because of what we had to do to save ourselves from COVID-19. So we can't rely on those numbers. What we need is the federal government to step up. And once the federal government steps up, then there's some ideas, whether it's multimillionaires taxes, looking at sort of like online sports betting. There's a range of ideas that are out there that we can bring to fore. But I think we don't want to put the cart before the horse. Let's get the federal government to do its job, and then we will supplement to sort of deal with the full need.
There's been a lot of conversation around race and police reform and things like that. But I first want to talk about the criminalization of false reporting that sort of came about after the footage of a confrontation between a white woman and a black man in the park, and her calling 911 to say that she was in danger and she felt threatened. And in this day and age, that action, as we've seen with other incidents with George Floyd and other black men, can be very dangerous.
That's right.
Talk to me a little bit about what's occurred since then.
Yeah, so the false reporting of an incident has and is already a crime. What the bills that we have been considering and one that has passed was basically to say, okay, if you falsely report an incident where race or going after a protected class is the purpose of your false reporting, for example, LGBTQ protected class, race protected class, and ethnicity protected class. If you do that, then there is a added penalty. So the two options we were looking at one was having that be considered a hate crime, at which point it would have been a higher charge on the false reporting. The other option was to look at sort of creating civil penalties that you have at your disposal so not only there's a possible criminal result, but also there's actually a money judgment that can be provided. So in the case of Christian Cooper, in the Amy Cooper case, the last names sometimes
it's weird.
They're unrelated. But in that case where Amy Cooper did that false 911 call on Christian Cooper, he not only would have the ability for the criminal piece on the false reporting, but then also he has a money judgment, civil penalty capability that this bill that passed would provide him. So it's really to discourage that kind of behavior,
right.
Which really was traumatizing, particularly as a black man being in a situation where you say to yourself, wow, I could easily be Christian Cooper. I could easily be in Central Park, and someone could weaponize their white womanhood on the African-American male. Very dangerous stuff. So we were definitely pushing that bill, and I'm glad that we got that accomplished.
Absolutely. And I think that, we've seen that kind of behavior happen against children, but it's not quite, the outcome isn't as dire as, for a black man. Is this a question of intent? I mean, with the Chris Cooper incident, he was recording it, so you saw what was happening, and it was such a benign scenario with the bird watching, put the dog on a leash thing. Mm-hmm. But isn't that subject to interpretation?
Absolutely, and this is the issue. It's not basically what would happen is the prosecution would say, given the facts that they have assembled, they would make the charge. They would say, listen, this, in addition to this being the false reporting of an incident, racial bias was a part of this conversation, and they'd have to prove that in court. Now it's easier to prove that when you have a video, right? But that's the thing, you'd have to prove it, and the defense would have the ability to say, that's not true, there wasn't racial bias, and here's why, and that's just something you have to deal with in the courtroom.
You recently had the Eric Garner chokehold Act signed. Obviously, this is crucial and important. Talk to me about how this came about. This has been a long time coming.
A long time coming. This bill was been around since 2014, and I think one of the issues that occurred was that, and you saw this in the trial with Officer Pantaleo, the defense was able to make the case that while it is true that Officer Pantaleo used the banned chokehold on Eric Garner, because the chokehold wasn't defined in criminal statute, therefore you were not able to get a particular criminal offense just on that. You had to make the case, well, there was strangulation was the issue, or murder or manslaughter. And the jury was not prepared to call it strangulation, manslaughter, or murder. So therefore, what we did, just to be safe, is say, okay, the chokehold or a similar restraint, which could also be a knee to the neck, because if you obstruct,
About restricting.
there you go. Any of that obstruction that leads to serious physical injury or death, that in and of itself is a Class C felony, violent felony, which can land you up to 15 years in prison. Period. So we took away the discretion as it relates to that obstruction for any purposes, whether it's a choke, whether it's the knee, whether it's your foot, whether you're sitting, whatever you do to obstruct air and breathing, we went through the throat or windpipe. We put it into a specific category. It's called chokehold or restraint. If you do, or similar restraint, if you do that, up to 15 years in prison. Period. And if this bill was in law before what happened to Eric Garner, Pantaleo would be in jail right now.
To choke somebody to death, and I'm not a cop, right? So if I choked somebody to death, it would be a crime.
Strangulation would be it would be.
Why wouldn't it still be a crime if you're a cop? Why do we need to be so specific about this thing for it to be considered a crime?
Yeah, because what happens is, particularly when you're dealing with police officers, civilians, there tends to become gray area that can be used like, well, he wasn't trying to do it. There was the police.
He's trying to control the situation.
He was trying to control, right.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all this wiggle room that always seeps into a conversation whenever it's a police civilian.
Because if I understand it, it's in their manual that they were not supposed to be using any sort of restrictive to the artery here that cuts off blood to the brain.
Exactly.
So now it's also a law that matches what's in their manual.
That's correct. That's right. And it's in executive law it's already executive law of our penal code. So the good news is that because we've taken away that discretion, no one can be confused. Okay. If you perform a chokehold, a similar restraint, right? We know what it looks like. We saw it in Minneapolis. That in and of itself, prison time. And I think that kind of accountability sort of sets the tone that police know that they're not above the law. And that to me is a big part of this whole premise is no one's above the law. And we expect our police to be accountable at a higher level than anyone else because we give them so much authority because they have the power to mete out lethal force.
Thank you so much, State Senator Brian Benjamin.
Thank you. And I think that kind of accountability sort of sets the tone that police know that they're not above the law.
Welcome back to Represent NYC on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. My name is Victoria Bert. We are joined now by Harvey Epstein, who's an assembly member in District 74. So, a lot of stuff has been happening within the last couple of weeks since the death of George Floyd and this massive call for police reform here in the city. Talk to me a little bit about what you've accomplished up in Albany.
Yeah, I think it's really been a trying time for our city, state, and country. And obviously the issues of systemic racism have just become more clear and apparent by the killing of George Floyd. And that allowed legislation that's been hanging on for years to come before the state legislature, just to make it illegal to use chokeholds. It's in the NYPD manual, but it wasn't illegal. To ensure that the 50A, which is a tool which traditionally was to protect the community and everyone from information, now has been really used as a sword by the police to ensure that their prior bad acts are being hidden. We learned early on the police officer who killed George Floyd had a 20-year history of police abuse. We don't know the same for Pantaleo, who killed Eric Gardner. In my district, we have an Officer Garcia, who brutalized one of my constituents, Donnie Wright. We don't have the history. And now with the repeal of 50A, it allows us to get that information. So we know as taxpayers how we're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars for police officers who are committing these crimes. And then really we need to be thinking, once it's repealed, is this really how we want our taxpayer dollars paid? And is this really the appropriate way that we use the police in our city, state, and country? So what does that mean? Do we want police in our schools? Should police officers giving out tickets for traffic infractions? Do we should have social workers in schools instead of police officers? Maybe we should have the Department of Transportation staff giving out tickets instead of police officers. Maybe we should have people who are trained to support the issues of people with mental health issues as first responders when people are being called instead of officers when we see lots of people with mental health struggles. I think we rely on the police to do a lot, and they aren't trained and aren't the best suited. The other issue is is the training and support sufficient for officers? Right now, you can get a 2-year associate degree at 20 years old and go into the NYPD. Are people mature enough to do that? Maybe they need a bachelor's degree. I'm a lawyer. I have an obligation I had to get a college degree, and then I had to go to law school, and then I have an obligation to do continuing legal education. I have an ongoing obligation in my career. Maybe we need to do the same with police officers.
So you mentioned also in their protests and police being at protests, and something that we saw during the last days, they've been protesting since, as we're taping now, for 20 days, but in the beginning, we definitely saw police officers covering their badges. Talk to me a little bit about that legislation that's going to make that something they can't do.
Yes. Right now, it's in the police manual. You're supposed to not cover your badge. In 2018, City Council passed a bill that requires police officers to disclose who they are and to give out business cards. What we've seen is, there's no penalties to that. So if you have a rule but there's no infractions and there's penalties, there's no obligation. I've actually approached officers and said, "Can I have your name and your badge number?" And they covered up the badge. I've seen it happen to myself, and I'm a white privileged man, and I see it happen throughout the protest where they had covering over their badge numbers, and they were just like, "We're instructed to do it." That can't be the law. We need to make sure that that's a crime, and that crime should be prosecuted. The idea of saying to an officer, "You can hide your identity," is deeply problematic, and deeply problematic that either a union or a system would allow that to happen. So we want to make sure, one, you can't do it, and two, if you do it, there's penalties associated with doing it.
Talk to me a little bit about the body cam. What is to stop them from implementing that same sort of protection against the body cam, covering it, stopping it, turning it off, taping it over?
Well, part of the package of bills we passed last week, thank you for a reminder, was around making sure that on any stop that they are, especially traffic stops, they have the body cam and the car cam on, and ensuring our state troopers now are required to have that as well. The governor has yet to sign the bill, but it's really to say, the best way to learn about something is to have the evidence there. What we've learned is the video evidence has been extremely helpful. The video evidence, of George Floyd's killing was useful to spur this outrage. It's not like this wasn't happening before, but the footage that we would all be able to watch made it that more impactful. And so I think people, one, if people are engaging in illegal conduct, we'll be able to prosecute them because we'll have the video cams. And two, is I think people will be less likely to engage in that behavior if they know they're being watched.
So talk to me a little bit about how do we now, do you think, move forward in this sort of like very frayed relationship between the community and the police?
I think we need better oversight of the police, honestly, and I think the mayor's fine. He hires a commissioner, but the mayor hires the chancellor, and we have school boards or CECs. We have oversight systems in place for accountability for our schools, but we don't have that for our officers. We have these precinct councils, but are just appointed by the local precinct. There's not like a body that gets elected to oversee the precincts to build the police community relations. A community board and a community education council or school board those are people who are embedded in the neighborhood, who've been appointed by their elected official or elected by the community, like their school community. Those people are invested and deeply committed to those neighborhoods. And then they have real responsibility and oversight over a system. That needs to be in place for the NYPD as well. We need much more community oversight and community engagement, because otherwise there's no accountability. An officer can do whatever they want. They'll be like, well, their captain's okay. If the captain doesn't feel accountable to the neighborhood that they're in, captains be like, we're good, because all they have to do is make sure that their commissioner is with them. But if there's some local accountability, it'll really change the dynamics.
I hope it does. I think it's a much needed change. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for taking the time to talk to me, and I hope you're well and taking safe precautions out there.